Welcome to Vineyard Hopkinton. As we follow Jesus together, we experience the Holy Spirit, create a multicultural community, and pursue kingdom of God justice.
So who here has ever cooked a meal and not gotten the praise that you expected? Throw your hand up. It is time to get your recognition. You'll feel good. There you go. You don't have to look at the person sitting next to you, Carol. But I saw that. Like, Tom, come on. There's a little bit of that going on. So Moses somehow talked to God and made an amazing meal happen, and listened to how everybody, thousands of people, treated him for it. Exodus 16, there too, the whole community of Israel complained about Moses and Aaron. If only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. That's like extra right there. That's pretty good. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate all the bread we wanted. But now you've brought us into the wilderness to starve us to death. Then the Lord said to Moses, look, I'm going to rain down food from heaven for you. Each day the people can go out and pick up as much food as they need for that day. You know, guys, humans are the best at complaining, right? We're not the only ones who complain. If you have pets, you understand this reality. Other beings do complain. But I think that we do it the loudest and we do it the longest, right? We are really, really good at it. I worked in customer service for 13 years and the one guarantee every day was that somebody would come in and complain about what we had done, and they were going to do it really for a long time and really loudly, and then they were going to leave, and we were going to turn to the person standing next to us and begin to complain about them coming in and complaining about us. And the cycle always continued. Every single day. I mean, it's like, who's worse, the toilet paper or the toothbrush, right? Who's got the worst job? Do you know the backstory to what I read in Exodus 16? They kind of referenced it, but the Israelites were slaves in Egypt for 400 years, generation upon generation upon generation in slavery. They worked, 16 to 18-hour days, really probably no breaks. They worked 7 days a week. They had terrible lives. I'm sure there was nothing good about their lives. And then God heard them, and he freed them, and he sent Moses and Aaron and others to lead them out of that. Amazing, right? And their response is what we just read. Freedom didn't stop them from writing this scathing Google review about Moses' incompetencies as a tour guide. They still got mad about it and told everybody. Pots of meat and all the bread that they wanted, which is a joke. What slave has you ever seen a picture of slaves where they had pots of meat and all the bread that they wanted? No, that's not how this works. But in the midst of their complaining, God still took care of them. And this is how kind God is. It says that those who had gathered a lot had nothing left over, and those who had gathered only a little had enough. Essentially, it's a nice way of saying that the lazy folks were full and the greedy folks were full. He took care of all people. And the only thing that he asked when you read Exodus 16 is that they don't store it overnight. You know what they guaranteed that they tried? They stored it overnight. And so they woke up the next morning, and it said that they go and check on it, and it was moldy and had maggots. That's a nice little surprise in your tent, right? First thing in the morning. But even when they broke the only rule that God gave them around food, the only consequence was that they had to go and take it and dump it somewhere far away from their tent so it didn't continue in their tent. And then you know what? There was still stuff to eat that day. That was it. God just kept feeding them. They tried to pull one over on him, and they kept feeding him. They said that it was bland and boring, and he kept feeding them. He wanted them to take a day off, so he said you could keep extra on this one night, and you'll have enough. And they complained that it wasn't fresh that day. And he still kept feeding them. You know, we as humans, we just love to show our competency at complaining. And still in that, God is generous to us. He provides for us even when our behavior and our attitudes are atrocious. He just keeps feeding us. We're in a series in the Gospel of Mark, and there are two miracles that Jesus does that parallel this feeding of innumerable people in the middle of the desert that I want to look at this morning, starting in Mark chapter 6. But the amazing thing is that with Jesus, they were able to have leftovers. What changed? What's different in the situation? And they could have leftovers without maggots. I guess I should clarify that. The Israelites complained, and Jesus had compassion. Let's look at this. Mark 6:32 through 44. So they left by boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. But many people recognized them and saw them leaving. People from many towns ran ahead along the shore and got there ahead of them. Jesus saw the huge crowds as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like a sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Late in the afternoon, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat." But Jesus said, "You feed them." "With what?" they asked. "We'd have to work for months to earn enough money to buy food for all these people." So he said, "How much bread do you have? Go and find out." They came back and they said, "We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." And then Jesus told them to have the people sit down in groups on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and he looked up towards heaven, and he blessed them. And then breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. And he also divided the fish for everyone to share. And they all ate as much as they wanted. And afterwards, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. And a total of 5,000 men and their families were fed. It's pretty astonishing, right? 5,000 men and their families, probably like 15 to 20,000 people, all fed from one little boy's school lunch. You know, like a stupid small amount feeds a stupid huge crowd that had gathered there. And on top of that, they had so much leftovers that they could have fed another few hundred people probably. But what catches my eye here is that the disciples said, "Get rid of everybody." And Jesus said, "Feed them." What was going on in this conversation that we kind of missed? You know, the disciples actually had good reason for wanting space in this instance. We're told right before this that they had just all found out that somebody who they respected, that some of them had followed and probably loved and cared about, that they looked up to. For Jesus, it was his cousin, that he had just been beheaded. John the Baptist was killed, beheaded. They had just found this out right before this story happens. And so they had actually left. They had tried to get away. That's why they were in the middle of nowhere, because they wanted some space to be able to grieve and process this huge loss that they had just experienced. And instead of having space to be able to do that, they have this huge crowd that gathers around them and won't leave. And Jesus' reaction in that instance is to have compassion on them. He did grieve later, so he did things in a healthy way, but first he fed the folks. And it wasn't because he had energy or because they had spent all day baking bread and they just had to give it away. It wasn't because he had come prepared for all these people to show up and he had this great talk. And it wasn't because he felt guilty. It was simply because he had compassion. And in this, Jesus shows us a better way than we see with the Israelites in the middle of the wilderness. In Exodus, they complained, and good news, they still had enough. But when Jesus had compassion, they had extras. They had leftovers. They had more than enough. So let's talk about what compassion looks like. Compassion means to have a deep empathy for another's suffering or struggles. Psalm 145 tells us that God has compassion for us. Listen to this. It says, "The Lord is merciful and compassionate, slow to get angry, filled with unfailing love. The Lord is good to everyone. He showers compassion on all his creation." You know, throughout the Old Testament, compassion is used over and over again. It's shown as this analogy, as a mother feeding her children. That's how God cares for us, with compassion. In Isaiah, we're told that it's specifically like a mother nursing her infant, that's what God's compassion is like for us. Refusing to forget, always providing, always caring for them. And so then we get to the New Testament. And good news is Jesus still carries that out. He still continues in this. He becomes kind of the living embodiment of compassion. Essentially, what we're shown through Jesus is that God became one of us so that he could care for us, his children, and so that he could sit and live with us in the midst of our suffering and our struggles. He became human to act on our behalf with compassion because he is compassion in the flesh. So in Mark 6, when we see that Jesus acted because of compassion for these people, it makes sense. Because to Jesus, compassion isn't just an emotion that we feel, it's an act that we live out. Compassion moved Jesus to feed these folks in the same way that a mother, if her kid comes to her and says, "Mom, I haven't eaten all day," will immediately start making them a sandwich. That's how God cares for us. It's just what you do, right? No choices in it. One theologian wrote that his compassion is overflowing, his provision is satisfying, and where we see lack, Jesus sees abundance. And what I love about this is that Jesus didn't just say, "I'll show you how to do it because this is my job and I'm God and I came here to do this." But he says, "Hey guys, let me show you how this is lived out." And he gives them a job in the compassion, right? They start to complain, and Jesus says, how about if we respond with compassion? How about if we do things a little bit different? He models it and gives them space to be able to carry it out. And he does it twice. He gives them 2 opportunities to learn this lesson. Whether or not they did, we'll find out. But 2 opportunities to learn. Mark chapter 8, this is what it says. About this time, another large crowd had gathered, and the people ran out of food again. So he's hinting at us like this isn't just a repeat story. And Jesus called his disciples and he told them, "I feel sorry for these people. Literally, I have compassion for them. They've been here with me for 3 days and they have nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry, they'll faint along the way. For some of them have come a long distance." And so his disciples replied, "Well, how are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness?" And Jesus said, "Well, how much bread do you have?" Kind of sounds repetitious at this point, right? It's the same things. 7 loaves. So Jesus told all the people to sit down. And he took the loaves and he thanked God for them and he broke them into pieces and he gave them to his disciples who distributed the bread to the crowd. And a few small fish were found too, so Jesus blessed those and told the disciples to distribute them. And they ate as much as they wanted. And afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were about 4,000 men in the crowd that day, and Jesus sent them home after they had eaten. So again, Mark's not just repeating himself and putting the same story in here twice. He says again, like he gives us these hints that like, yes, this did happen twice, and let me tell you why it's happening here twice. He's a very concise and direct author. And so he's repeating it because he wants us to figure out something theologically. So let's talk about what it is that he's trying to teach us. So he feeds 5,000 in Mark 6, feeds 4,000 in Mark 9. 15,000, 12,000 probably. There's 5 loaves and 2 fish in one. There's 7 loaves and a few fish in another. They're about 1 day away from the town in the first story. The second story, they've been out in the wilderness for like 3 days. In the section around, it kind of gives a little geography and says that they're north of Galilee in Mark 6. They're southeast of Galilee in Mark 9. There's 12 baskets in Mark 6 or 7 in Mark 9. 1 prayer for food versus 1 prayer for the bread and 1 for fish. It's just not like if you do these things, then this will happen. You know what I mean? Like he does it differently. Here's what Mark wants us to get though. In the first story, it's mostly Jews. And in the second story, it's mostly Gentiles. Jesus says that it is people who had come from a long distance, which in the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, when they were talking about people who were not Jewish, they would say, those people who come from a long distance. They would use this exact same phrase. So Jesus is pulling direct from the prophets and saying, here, you know what this implies. This means people who are not already Jewish and following God in the same way that we do. And on top of that, for the feeding the 5,000, I don't think that's just coincidentally that he says that there's 12, which is 12 tribes of Israel. It's like the Jewish number for complete. And then in the other one, there's 7 baskets, 7 days of creation, kind of the biblical number for complete. What Mark's saying is that whether you're an Israelite or a Gentile, doesn't matter who you are, God's willing and able to provide all that you need. And he's even going to give you some leftovers afterwards. Doesn't matter where you started, as long as you're with him. In both instances, what Jesus did is he found what was available. He expressed gratitude for what was available, even though it was a pitiful amount, right? And he implicitly trusted that God was going to figure out a way to provide everything that they needed. Essentially, he kind of says that compassion is trust, gratitude, and generosity lived out. Trust, gratitude, and generosity. And then he invites the disciples to live with trust, gratitude, and generosity. Again, you can be terrible and God will still provide everything you need. That's kind of good news, guys, because I'm not always in a Jesus frame of mind when 12,000 people ask me for something, right? Like, I don't know about you, but sometimes that it just pokes all my buttons. So whether it's Israel in the desert or Jesus in the wilderness, he always gives us enough. If you allow your life to be placed in God's hand, I can guarantee that he will always give you enough. The Israelites were fed, he'll feed you. But there's a difference between enough and having leftovers, right? Between cleaning the plate and being like, I'm still a little hungry, and man, there's so much we could feed another house. And leftovers come when you join in the compassion of Jesus. Jesus always is saying, go and do the things that you see me doing. Go and live this out. Go and bless other people. He's always repeating that over and over again. But it's our choice whether or not we want to join in it. So the question to us is, complain or compassion? Which one are we going to choose? God's kind enough to give you enough, whichever way you go, but only one has leftovers. And the disciples still hadn't fully figured this out. Listen to the last part of this story from Mark 8:14. But the disciples had forgotten to bring any food. This is immediately after gathering 7 baskets of leftovers. And they only had 1 loaf of bread with them in the boat. Like the tension must have been high at this point. And so they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. And Jesus knew what they were saying, so he said, why are you arguing about having no bread? Don't you know or understand yet? Are your hearts too hard to take it in? Don't you remember anything at all? When I fed 5,000, how many baskets of leftovers were there? 12. And when I fed 4,000, how many baskets of leftovers? 7. So don't you understand yet? What Jesus is saying is that like you just collected 12 and then 7 baskets of leftovers. You watched me take a really tiny amount of food and feed a small town, a small city, maybe back in their day, a large city. Like you just watched me do this. And now, like an hour and a half later, you're nervous that you don't have enough food? Really? You don't realize what the thing is that worked in this? That I was here and I was doing it? Who's the one who broke the bread and it multiplied? You don't get it? Whether it's 12 for Israel or 7 for the Gentiles, he's always got enough bread to start the party all over again. You just have to trust him. The disciples struggled to be able to take that in. And when the choice came again, compassion or complaining, well, we saw what they did. So the question for us, friends, when the choice is placed in front of us, compassion or complaining, what will we choose? We always have reasons to complain, right? There's always something. You always got something that you can complain about. Something that happened, some situation that's stressing you out, some lack that you're feeling pressure about, some just desire for space. You know, maybe it's just like the disciples. You're like, I actually just want to kind of grieve. And instead, I got these other people who are staring at me right now. And that's like a good and a real desire, right? But there's always something to complain about. The question is, are we willing to take the step towards compassion? We often say, like, I don't have enough energy for that. But Jesus is saying that if we allow ourselves to be moved by compassion, you're not going to be wrung dry. You're not going to be emptied and left just wishing and hoping you had saved some for yourself. You're not going to just have enough, and then after you do everything for everybody else, you'll be like, that enough was not enough. But if you're moved by compassion, you're going to have leftovers. You're still going to have what you need, even after you've taken that chance to care for others that are around you. How do we live this out? You know, I was thinking about this, and I was reminded of something that happened in our neighborhood like 6 to 8 weeks ago. One of our neighbors texted Sarah and I first thing in the morning and said that our next door neighbor had passed away overnight. Our next door neighbor it was not a shock that he passed away. He was 88, 89, a very nice, kind, older guy who was often out walking his dog. And when he would go out walking his dog, everybody in the neighborhood would go and talk to him. And so if he was out, you could guarantee somebody else was going out to hang out with him and spend 5 minutes and talk with him. Him and I would talk about baseball a lot because I like baseball and he likes baseball. And I think I just have the same, hobby likes as an 88-year-old man, is I think what was proven in it. We even exchanged books a few times. And so when he moved in like, I don't know, a month after we moved in. And before he moved in, Sarah was praying that somebody with kids would move into the house because it's right next to our backyard. And instead, we got a guy in his 80s, which was not the answer that she was looking for. But he was really just a blessing to the whole neighborhood. And so we're texting about like the funeral plans and stuff like that. And I had this idea. I was like, what if we just kind of all gathered sometime in the next week with kids and everybody in his front yard, because that's kind of how our neighborhood is. And like, we'll bring ice cream, One of the other neighbors was like, we'll bring chalk and the kids can write like messages and like process together, and the adults can all tell stories and just remember him. And so we did it, and we ended up doing it on the same day as his funeral, which was not planned. But and then his kids and his grandkids live close by too, so they ended up coming. And we all just spent like an hour to 2 hours just hanging out, remembering him well, and doing life. And we all walked away with leftovers that night. My question for us is, who around you needs fed? Who around you has Jesus placed there so that you can have compassion on them and live it out and show that to them? Because friends, there's always more than enough.